Tales from the Terran Republic. The Luau and History Lesson Conclusion. The next morning, Captain Zurul and Shelia were lounging against the side of the Paper Tiger, sipping Terran coffee while some of Kolvatsk's workers were transferring cargo between their ships. "Oh, this shit is as nasty as I remember, and every bit as effective," the captain said as he slurped. "What do you mean?" "This is Kona," Shelia replied groggily. Hell of a party last night. The lieutenant get to bed okay?" The captain just laughed and shook his head. "Eventually. She spent a few unhappy hours jettisoning her cargo, but she survived," the captain laughed. "While she will be feeling that today, I think as her memory clears, that will be the least of her concerns." "Ah, yes," Shelia said with a grin. "The fair maiden. You should really take care of that. The way she was ogling you, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. She was flashing those colors." "We will just pretend that didn't happen," the captain laughed. He turned to watch pallet after pallet of produce leaving the Class 12. "Are you sure this is okay?" he asked. "Oh, please," Shelia said dismissively. "You saved my ass at least twice. A few pounds of goodies is nothing. Besides," she said as she gestured to the pallets of ammunition, "you are a paying customer after all, even if you are going to use these premium Mark 15s in those sorry rifles of yours. The Harbinger assault rifle is superior to your antiquated AKs in every parameter that can be measured," the captain said, pointing a tentacle at her. "Better recoil management, lighter weight, superior optics. Recoil management because you can't handle a real gun, and optics because you Juan can't shoot. Care to have a little competition?" "Not against Night Guard," Shelia laughed. She turned and looked towards his ship. Are you guys supposed to be shaped that way?" she asked as she pointed towards Lieutenant Guzala, who was miserably crawling towards them. "Good morning, Lieutenant," the captain said with a chuckle. "How are we feeling today?" I'm well, sir," the lieutenant said miserably, barely able to look him in the eyes. "I have the payment prepared as instructed." She handed him a data crystal carefully so as not to touch him. The captain took it with great amusement. "Are you sure this is permissible?" she asked. "It is if I say it is," the captain said as he handed the crystal over to Shelia. "This pittance for a mountain of premium Terran ammunition is a bargain." "I don't suppose you have some spare gyrojet slugs lying around, do you?" Shelia asked as she pocketed the crystal. "Now that is definitely not permissible," the captain said with a laugh. "Besides, the new gyrojet rounds no longer chamber in a Terran shotgun. We have the new prototype launchers." "Oh, can I see? Can I see?" Shelia exclaimed as she jumped up and down excitedly. "I see no reason why you can't," the captain replied. As they were setting out some targets, a Zhush approached them. "Excuse me," the female Zhush hesitantly asked. "Have you seen Tsunkal?" "No, can't say that I have," Shelia said with a grin. "Last I saw him was at the party." "Oh, thank you," the Zhush said and scuttled away stiffly. Shelia watched her leave with a huge grin on her face. "Well, you go tea," she laughed. The captain looked at her, slightly confused. "What? Sue, you freaks do things differently," Shelia said with a laugh. "For the rest of us, there are certain things we have in common, and that, my friend, was a pissed-off mom." By the time lunch rolled around, everybody was finally up and moving, even if they were a little red-eyed or misshapen, depending on the species. As everyone was gathering for a communal meal, the leader of the Zhush approached the Terrans. "I must apologize," he said. "What for?" Jacob asked. "The meat we purchased was not chicken as we were told. Human friend Jesse showed me an image of a chicken, and it is a bird, not a six-legged reptile." "Don't worry about it," Jacob laughed. "It's the thought that counts. It was good no matter how many legs it had." As everyone was sitting down and eating, one of the Zhush, barely able to contain herself, asked, "So what happened next?" "Ah, yes, where were we?" the captain asked. "The Terrans had just driven all of you out of the system." "Yes, well, the military high command was beside itself," the captain continued. "The fact that so many high-ranking positions had been replaced by incompetence certainly didn't help. It took weeks to put together an expeditionary force. They gave the Terrans weeks to dig in." He shook his head. "Weeks. One doesn't give the Terrans weeks to prepare. It probably wouldn't have made all that much difference, but it certainly didn't help." "No, it didn't," said an old Juan first sergeant. "You were in that first group, weren't you, old man?" the captain asked. "Old man, you are just as close to your 1 in 50 as I am," the Juan laughed. "A full Juan military career is 150 years, Shelia explained to the Zhush. "They consider 150 years lifetime service." "Yeah, and I'm getting close," the old Juan said proudly. "Not many make the full stretch. Anyhow, I was just regular infantry back then, and just a kid at that. Hadn't even seen combat. Not that there was much combat to see back in those days. Just rogue outposts or pirates. We didn't get much but overconfident shit from official channels, but our commander gave us the real scoop, so we knew it wasn't going to be a fish dinner, he said as his chromatophores flashed in wry amusement. We knew about as much as anyone, but that wasn't much. All we knew for sure is that they utterly destroyed the household troops, and that they used ancient weapons, but that those ancient weapons worked. At least we were somewhat prepared, unlike a lot of others. He stopped to eat a few mouthfuls. Those first few days went well, the captain said while the other Huon ate. There was no real opposition in space except for mines and drones. That being said, both the mines, which were missiles set to target anything within range, and those damned drones were both very dangerous. And while no ship was destroyed, several had to leave the system after getting too close. The first place they targeted both for tactical and pride reasons was Zeus. When they got there, they encountered their first real fight. The place was bristling with missiles, and several ships were lost, but we claimed our first victory. Sort of. Once we started taking the stations, we found out they were deserted. There was nothing there but traps and auto-turrets, no people. We fought a battle against nothing but AIs. Yeah, I heard from the Marines that taking those stations was hellish. No people, like the captain said, but those empty halls killed a lot of Juan, the old first sergeant said. We were starting to see the pure evil cunning that we were up against. He paused while he sipped on some kelp tea. When we finally took the place, it was weird. It looked gutted. You could see where they had just torn stuff off the walls, the deck, wherever. It's like they ripped out parts of the factories and took them. We didn't know what happened or where they went, but all of the gas miners were missing. We quickly found out that they took what they could and retreated into Jupiter itself. They modified those miners and turned them into flying factories and shipbuilding plants, and went down where we couldn't reach them. They turned Jupiter itself into a fortress. Yeah, Shelia said. In case anyone was wondering exactly how long one of those Leviathans can stay down in Jupiter, the answer is forever. In classic Terran fashion, they were over-designed so that they could stay down as long as they needed. In this case, they were down there the whole time. What did they eat? One of the Jews asked. Jovian rice, the one thing they would never run out of. Oh, I love that stuff, one of the Juan enthused. It makes the best sushi. Well, it should, Shelia said as she ate. Jovian sushi rice is designed to do just that. It's genetically engineered, the Juan asked. Shelia just laughed. I didn't say that it was genetically engineered. I said that it was designed. Jovian rice is a synthetic edible polymer. It's plastic. Yep, but it's an easily digested, nutritionally complete plastic, Shelia said. It's what really ended the Sol Wars. Once they got production up and running, they could produce an unlimited amount. It ended the famine. The guns were secondary. So you had gigantic flying factories with unlimited food in a place that couldn't be reached by the Imperial forces. You might guess that would cause some problems later on. That they did, the first sergeant said. But that was later on in the story. At this point, things were going okay. Zeus was neutralized, or so we thought, and we took the surface of Mars and Luna. The fighting was pretty heavy, and we took a lot of casualties, but we in the end won that battle. What we didn't know was that the Terrans expected to lose. They didn't commit a lot to keeping the surface of either. They knew that it was a losing fight. They just wanted us to pay a price in blood before they retreated underground. He sighed heavily. We thought we had the upper hand until we fucked up and tried to go into the tunnels. Those warrens, it was like chasing a venom eel into its den. We didn't get 100 yards before we started dying in droves. We had been issued heavy combat armor, and it did hold up well against their small arms for the first couple of months. But it wasn't small arms in those tunnels. We had our first introductions to Terran heavy machine guns, grenade launchers, mines, and all the other assorted nastiness that you guys know, love, and have occasionally been issued. The old Juan laughed ruefully. Needless to say, our first encounter with that shit did not go well. In every case, our forces were driven out of the tunnels. In the end, all we could do was hold the surface to keep them down, and even that sucked. The fuckers. He waved his tentacles around angrily. Standing guard around those eel holes just opened us up to raids from below. They would boil up out of the ground somewhere, usually someplace we hadn't found yet because it wasn't there yesterday. Hit us hard, dive back down a hole, then blow up the passage, he snarled. Then a couple of days later, the whole thing would happen again. He flashed anger. Holding those positions was just an exercise in attrition, just like the whole ground war. Those goddamn idiots in charge had no idea what they were doing. He stopped to sip more tea. At least I wasn't on Terra. Poor fucklings. They didn't have a chance. He started to mutter and sip tea. Yeah, we knew that holding the surface of Mars and Luna was a lost cause, but Terra, we decided we were going to hold that shit, Shelia said almost sympathetically. That is where we decided to really fight. Mars and Luna were just places to hide people and factories below ground, purely a defensive fight. Terra, on the other hand, was hell, the old Juan continued. We thought we were warriors, he said, shaking his head. Just because we could march in a parade or that our uniforms were perfect, we thought we were good soldiers. He flashed his chromatophores in a wry smile. Our drills and war games were pathetic. Nothing like what we do today. Maybe a unit had participated in attacking a pirate outpost with 10 times the forces that were needed, because units were desperate for a ribbon on their pennant. We weren't warriors, not like you kids. The Terrans back then were warriors. They were, if anything, even harder than their grandchildren today. Those fighters, they had a decade of fighting in unimaginable horror. They didn't blink. They didn't flinch. They didn't miss. We had a very rude awakening pretty damn quickly. He paused for another sip of tea. They were like ghosts, vengeful spirits. One second they were there, pelting you with fire, and the second they were gone without a trace. They would even take their dead if they had any. You couldn't scan for them? One of the Juan asked. If anyone turned on an active scanner, they would likely be beaten to death, the first sergeant said with a rueful laugh. Scanning with the crap we were issued back then was the absolute last thing you wanted to do. We made the mistake of thinking of the Terrans as a primitive, backward people, but they weren't. They never were. They were a sophisticated, technologically advanced race and had 30 years to study our tech. They knew exactly what they were doing. With their scanner camouflage, we were lucky to pick up anything at 500 meters. Usually we had to be within 200 meters to pick them up, and by then we were well within range. What made matters worse was that they could detect our active scanner signals from well over a kilometer away. Just perfect for their mortars. They would have a mortar team behind their skirmish line. Turn on a scanner and get a shell on your head. Thank the lineage that they weren't like the ones they have now. Mostly it was just frag. Until we fucked up. Fucked up? Yeah, we did the one thing you should never ever do. We got into an atrocity contest with the Terrans. The Terrans had these villages, the old first sergeant continued. They were these small settlements all over, mostly populated with the young, the old, and people who didn't want to or couldn't fight for one reason or another. These places were clearly marked as non-combatant and just kept to themselves, growing food and trying to survive as best as they could, the old Yuan said. We had them under surveillance and could confirm that the only contact that took place between them and the fighters was when the fighters dropped off people too wounded to fight anymore and supplies. That's right, the fighters supplied them, not the other way around. They were 100% not involved. I don't like where this is heading, one of the troopers said grimly. You would be right. After over a year of getting absolutely nowhere anywhere, the leaders decided that those villages just had to be helping the fighters. They were making food after all. The old Yuan spat. That was their official reason. Actually, they were just pissed off that they were getting their asses handed to them. They also really didn't get the Terrans. They figured that if they started reprisal attacks that it would damage morale and force them to surrender. The old Yuan smiled grimly. Of course, that wasn't what happened at all. Never get into an atrocity contest with Terrans. Speaking of, he said as he turned to the Terrans, I am proud to be your ally and will always remember what you did during the Great War, but what you did to the Feds, that was just wrong. Hey, they pissed us off, Sheila said matter-of-factly. Besides, we couldn't fight a conventional war. We would have lost. If we let them mass their entire fleet against us even, we wouldn't have been able to hold the line, she said, then flashed the evilest grin. So we figured that since they had no problems with surprise attacks, they would be okay with us returning the favor. If we started just popping into random systems and proceeded to fuck some shit up, they would have to guard everywhere and still fight us. A few Moray missile boats zip in and nuke a few space stations here. A few stilettos pop in and wipe out some shipping there. A fucking carrier group or a Sovngarde-class battleship pop in and just keep destroying until they can mass enough of a force to try to stop them. Each strike diverted forces and had every system in the Federation screaming for ships to protect them in case they were next. It also made it very personal. It would be one thing if the war was a distant thing. They could ignore it, saying that they were probably in the right. It was completely another thing when they woke up every morning wondering if that day was the day they were going to get a visit. It got people asking questions. Sheila shrugged. It was fucked up, but it worked. They weren't Terrans. They weren't used to the idea of everything burning like we are. It wasn't long before they didn't want to play anymore. Operation Fuck Some Shit Up was a success. Personally, I think we should have kept at it. Yeah, but blowing up schools, libraries, universities, hospitals, cultural landmarks? Hey, we told them to evacuate in plenty of time, and yes, cultural landmarks. That 15,000-year-old temple. Gone. That ancient palace. Bye-bye. Anything and everything that allowed a planet to operate on a daily basis or define the species as a people was systematically destroyed. We got that shit down to a science. Give the retribution a couple of days and there would be nothing left. A light strike group could do tremendous damage in a few hours. It was fucked up, but so was going for our throat when we were in the state that we were in. Fuck 'em. See, the old Yuan said as he gestured to Sheila. They don't even feel bad about it. This is the game we started with these evil fucks. He shook his head. It had what was perhaps an even worse effect as well. He sighed heavily. I am an Imperial soldier. I will fight and die on command. Tell me to attack a collective warrior unarmed, and I will do it without hesitation, he said, and then paused. I am not, however, part of a death squad. I am not a murderer. I am not a terrorist. Telling Imperial soldiers to wipe out unarmed children did not work. Hell, Terrans won't do that. He paused again and looked at the Terrans. Right? He asked with just a touch of uncertainty in his voice. Not even porky kids, Sheila said firmly. Not even the piglets. Even during the Federation War, when we burned down the schools, we made damn sure they were empty. And that was us at our most pissed off. Right, the old first sergeant said. A lot of us flat out refused. So they called it a mutiny and arrested entire companies of soldiers who refused en masse. Other Yuan would go to one of the targets, and as soon as the first Terran fired a shot, they would surrender. The old Yuan laughed for the first time during the story. It was fucking hilarious. One old Terran would capture 20 Yuan troopers at once. Fighter pilots would suddenly lose control of their ships and crash. It was a complete shit show. The Great Mutiny, as we called it. He laughed some more and then stopped. Unfortunately, some soldiers followed their orders. He sighed and looked at his crew. We didn't know something very, very important. Long ago in ancient times, a war was waged which was so horrible that after it had ended, the nations of Terra met in order to make some rules to at least try to prevent the worst of the horrors they created. When the Terran war chiefs and generals met to plan the war, they decided to follow this convention. They were treating us as a legitimate foe and were following those rules. He stopped and took a sip. Once we started hitting civilian targets, those rules went straight out the window. He shook his head. It was like they started having a competition on who could be the most fucked up, and each week there was some new horror coming out of their underground factories. Most of them, you know. White phosphorus aerosol rounds packed with all sorts of hell. Fragmenting toxic bullets, chemical and biological weapons, and all the rest of the 40 hells we now have in our arsenals as well. Almost everything that we used on the bugs was used on us. Then they perfected the art of fucked up with the red tip and red mist. A collective moan issued from the Juan. What's a red tip and red mist? Tsonkal asked. One of the few things I can't get my hands on and wouldn't sell if I did, Sheila replied. Those are kept under lock and key in the vault of fucked up toys with the rest of the fucked up toys. It's nanotech. Thousands of nanomachines designed to tear apart a target from the inside, starting with the nerves just to be nasty. Once hit by a red tip round, there is nothing anyone can do to help a victim except euthanasia. I have 5. I used to have 6. I am never doing that to someone again. She shuddered. They work great on bugs, though, she said cheerfully. It's fun to watch them twitch. Red mist is the same thing in grenade or mortar form, the old Juan said quietly. It drills in from the outside. Yeah, I got to see an airstrike with that stuff on some bugs once, Jacob said with a smile. It's the only time I felt sorry for them. Fortunately for the whole galaxy, they are expensive as hell to make, and even we Terrans have some limits. Unless you are a bug, Sheila said while smiling entirely too much. Yeah, we thought we had it bad before. Now we were going through a living hell, the first sergeant said grimly. Each day another unit got hit with something right from the depths of the abyss, and often it was something brand new. Casualties were heavy. Very heavy, as we somehow tried to adapt. He paused. Thank the Empress I was on Mars. Terra had turned into the fires of hell. Yeah, I heard about it from my grandmother, Sheila said. She was part of one of the surface strike teams. Even that old monster felt bad about everything that went down. And she has human skulls in her house as decorations. Sheesh, the old Juan said. She have any beaks? Sheila said, looking away. Figures. Back in the day, Terrans were about 10 times worse than they are now. They were fucking monsters, the old Juan said without malice. Speaking of 10 times worse, he said. Our brass was entirely made up of the Emperor's hole lickers eager for glory. They kept throwing yuan and resources at Terra. We were almost grateful when the long-range attack drones started flying out of Jupiter and hunting anything that moved. It meant that they couldn't throw reinforcements around as freely, and even they weren't safe in their comfy ships and station anymore. It's fucked up, but we took great satisfaction in the fact that they started getting hit. A general even got eaten by red mist in his own ship. The Juan laughed grimly. I hated that whole liquor, he said as he laughed even more. It was about that time that the Emperor was getting tired of no progress and replaced his buddies with officers that were worth a fuck. The old Juan flashed colors of relief. The first thing they did was stop the reprisal attacks and pulled everyone off of Terra. The ground forces there had turned into nothing but moist targets by that point, he said with a shrug. We never set foot on Terra again. The only thing we did was blockade the planet and do long-range bombardment and airstrikes to keep them in their holes. And even that was risky. Their drones were getting better each month. We were losing good pilots to AIs. It wasn't good for morale, I will tell you that. Yeah, the captain said. It was about then that the next big expeditionary force was sent. I was a Lancer pilot and had the dubious honor of being a drone dancer. Our job was to engage the drones and take them out. You had to be pretty good to do the job and not get nailed, especially after they started arming those squids. It's funny, a missile with its own missiles. I remember when they started shooting back. It was quite the surprise. The captain chuckled as he looked off into space. AI or not, fighting those bastards was the most fun I have ever had. Well, I'm glad that at least one of us was enjoying themselves, the old trooper said, making a rude gesture. The captain laughed. Sorry, I forgot myself there for a moment. He continued. Things stayed like that for almost another year. We were at a stalemate. We got better at dealing with the drones, and they got better at defending their holes. They did eventually lose Luna. We did achieve that small victory. We didn't manage to dig all of them out, but they had to cease operations and just hide deep under the surface. For a while. Mars was mostly neutralized. There would still be attacks, but the casualty rate was down even if we still couldn't take the tunnels. No, we couldn't, the old Yuan said. If we managed to get too far, they would just blow the tunnel, collapsing it on top of us. So we took advantage of that by using AI-controlled attack bots. With them, we could force them to blow their own tunnels, keeping them at bay at least a little bit. We seemed to be making progress, slow, expensive progress, but definite progress, the captain said. Morale was high, casualties were down, the Terrans were reduced to hiding in their holes, or so we thought. He paused to take a sip of coffee and winced at the taste. Gods, this stuff is awful. Then things took a definite turn for the worse. From Jupiter and Terra, spacecraft launched. The Terrans had finally built their first fleet, he said as he shook his head. We weren't too worried at first. The first thing that started popping up is something you guys would recognize today. They haven't changed all that much, the humble turtle light cargo vessel. He laughed ruefully. We thought it wasn't that big of a deal. Sure, they made things a little difficult. They could jump between Terra and Jupiter and go deep enough into Jupiter's atmosphere that one of the miners could come up and get them without being exposed for too long. Big deal, right? Wrong. That meant that Zeus got metal and other resources that greatly increased their production capacity, which meant more ships. We also thought that the turtles just had interplanetary capacity. Wrong again. Every now and then a turtle would go somewhere else. The captain chuckled. They went to what is now the secret Terran shipyard, which is Empress knows where. They were now free to set up big high-capacity factories and huge shipyards. And we all know exactly how industrious Terrans can be when they want to, and they wanted to believe me. The captain refilled his coffee dish. I seriously don't know why I drink this shit. Caffeine is one hell of a drug, Sheila said, raising her own mug. Blee, the captain said as he took another sip. Things went downhill and downhill quickly after that. There was now no limit to the Terran's production capacity. We were now fighting Terran industry, a fight nobody wants. A few ships became dozens and not just turtles. The first spacecraft that are now the Moray patrol craft appeared, and we had to contend with fast missile boats with real jump drives that could effectively raid our shipping not just on Terra but on our supply routes. Then the fun really started. The Shrike Mark 1s appeared. They don't have interstellar drives, but a modified turtle can haul one. Those early Shrikes weren't anywhere as deadly as the Mark 12s, thank the lineage, but they were still nasty. We now had a real fight on our hands, the captain said as he sipped his coffee. Then the first Stiletto corvettes popped up, and those fuckers were every bit as nasty as they are now. Combined Stiletto, Moray, and Shrike attack groups started to prowl the inner solar system, engaging anything that got too close. We were knocking them around pretty good, but as soon as we took one out, 2 more jumped into the system. There was no end to them. Then, we got the shock of our lives, the captain said as he took a sip and looked at his crew. The first nukes. Suddenly, even a little Shrike was a threat to anything we had. To use my favorite Terran phrase, shit got real. We had a very real battle now. Not only were we trying to hold space against an enemy with a seemingly endless supply of spacecraft, but with space superiority contested, our surface forces once again were being attacked and attacked for real. The Terrans had just been buying time, and now they were attacking in force with an army much larger and well-equipped than we could imagine. Yeah, the old first sergeant said. Mars became a real battleground. Those bastards had built armored vehicles, Shrikes, heavy weapons, the whole thing, and boiled up out of the ground like flesh flies. We didn't know what hit us. The old Yuan said as he sipped his tea. Thank the creators that they had calmed down a bit from our stupid reprisal attacks. They actually took prisoners and treated them according to the Convention of Geneva. Even with reinforcements, we ultimately lost Mars. Luna was getting invaded as well as the survivors there were counterattacking. So the surviving Mars forces were transferred there in an attempt to somehow hold it. But space superiority that close to Terra was iffy at best. We couldn't keep Terran forces from landing. We did give them hell, though. We were on Luna for the whole war. They never could take it. It was around year 3 that things came to a head, the captain said. Terra wasn't the only system that was suffering under the new Emperor, and several planets had gone from civil unrest to full-bore resistance groups. Suddenly, Terran weapons and equipment started appearing in other systems. The Kalesh system, suddenly very well equipped with both arms and spacecraft, exploded into full revolt, and the mucks soon followed. The Terrans had started reaching out to other Imperial systems and were handing out an unending fountain of arms, spacecraft, supplies, rations, you name it. Turtles were swarming like Karga all over, and stilettos and morays were being handed out like party favors. It was like 100 Sheilas were dancing around the Empire, the captain said with a hearty laugh. Things were going downhill fast, and not just in Sol anymore. The problems were starting to spread, and turtles were spotted in over a dozen systems. We were looking at a real problem. 100 Sheilas, Tsunkal said with a laugh. Now there's an image. Right? The captain laughed. Well, the Emperor was losing it. Everyone was blaming everyone. The military high command was freaking out. Terra was bad enough. But now 3 systems were in full revolt, and AKs were starting to go bang in a dozen more. The Emperor then gave the order to turn Terra into glass. Talk about a complete and utter waste of time. Massive bombardment of Terra, Luna, and Mars did take place, but what the hell did they hit? There was nothing on the surface. It was a complete and total waste of time. They were shelling 2 lifeless worlds and a planet that was mostly ash and dead scrubland. Any remaining civilians had been relocated out of the system or moved underground into an ever-expanding deep tunnel network. There was nothing on the surface left to hit. In return, they placed ship after ship in range of surface drones, and Terran attack craft were jumping in and out of the system constantly. Losses were mounting, and Terran weapons and ships were still being exported en masse. The real target worth hitting was not in Sol, and we had and still have no idea where it is. Yeah, the whole Empire was being shaken, the old first sergeant said. There were only 3 systems where there was any real revolt, and a few more where there was now an armed resistance. It was just a little smudge compared to the entirety of the Empire, but this had never happened before. The Emperor was now nearly insane and was making genocidal orders left and right. Terra was pretty much immune, but Kalesh and Mux were vulnerable, and the loss of life was getting serious. The murderous orders from the Emperor did quell a lot of systems, but the Mux and the Kalesh were damn near Terran, and it just made them more violent, and just like on Terra, a lot of the Imperial forces balked at genocide, the captain said. In fact, reports of Imperial forces turning on the death squads and defending the civilians were starting to become more and more frequent. The Great Mutiny was spreading just like Terran arms, but this mutiny wasn't just quitting or surrendering. The soldiers were actively engaging the death squads. The great houses were starting to become very uncomfortable, and there were rumblings that something was afoot. Imperial forces were already starting to turn, and the great houses were starting to mobilize their soldiers. We were looking down the barrel of a full-bore civil war. Damn, Jesse said. I had no idea it got that bad. Oh, it did, the captain said. Sol was becoming an Imperial scrapyard. Mux and Kalesh were in complete revolt, and several other systems were starting to fall apart. Imperial forces started shooting other Imperial forces, and the great houses were getting concerned to the point that their private armies were mobilized. The Empire, which had stood for 2,000 years, was in more peril than it had been in centuries, perhaps longer. The captain sipped some more coffee, and ripples of revulsion danced across his hide. And thus, he said, we come to the rise of the Kayan Empress. The Empire was falling apart. Terra was a complete shitshow, with Kalesh and Mux catching up quick. Her brother had completely lost it, and the great houses were starting to really consider a coup. One night she decided that enough was enough. That night she went to the Royal Museum and took Keralux, the Maraxel wielded by the Black Emperor 1,500 years ago. The next day she traveled to Asteria, the location of the Golden Palace, and summoned the heads of the great houses. They arrived, and she had a little chat with them. Nobody knows for certain what was said, but in the end they ceased their mobilization and pledged fealty to her. A few days later she returned to the Royal Palace. The captain looked over at his crew. You guys probably know what happened next. The next morning the Emperor, who often slept until noon, was awakened by his servants and was told that he should go to the throne room. He, with some annoyance, eventually showed up. To his shock, his sister was sitting on the throne in a pretty Kayan dress, Kerelex in hand and their father behind her. He was then told that his reign was over, his bags packed and a ship was waiting. He laughed and told her that there was no way that this would happen. He had too many lords behind him. The Empress had a long table carried in covered with a cayenne-dappled sheet. She then said, "Oh, you mean them?" and had the sheet removed, revealing the severed faces of all of his supporters. "Don't look so surprised, brother dear," she said as he vomited. "You wanted the grand old days back. This is what we did back then." He then realized why her gown was cayenne. That was the last anyone saw or heard of him. The captain paused and smiled. "There are plenty of rumors, but all anyone knows for sure is that neither color nor tentacle of him has even been seen again." "I've always liked her," Sheila said with a laugh. "She has style." "That she does," the captain said with a laugh. "In keeping with the you wanted the old days back theme, what happened next was one of the bloodiest purges in recent history, with a lot of it done by her hand. Turns out that she is a blade dancer and studied the martial art as part of her royal education. It isn't a true combat style, but she is a walking food processor. She went from system to system, planet to planet, and on each one that suffered she had the Juon responsible hauled before her, and she sliced them apart, always wearing the same cyan-stained gown." The captain chuckled. She wasn't fucking around either. That little Golden Age cult? Most fell to her blade as she sardonically quoted their philosophy back to them. "Nice," Tsunkal said, rubbing his mandibles in a chuckle. "I like her." The shooting on Terra, Kalesh, Mux, and the other systems in conflict stopped immediately, and all troops were withdrawn, the captain said as he gagged on another sip of coffee. "She personally showed up in Terra and called for the leader of the Terrans to come forth. It should come as no surprise that Tak Nakamura was selected to speak for Terra. She landed on Hentai Island with no real notice," the captain said, giggling. "Remember when we said that many of us had stopped wearing clothes?" "No," one of the troopers exclaimed. "Yes," the captain replied. "She landed on the beach and beheld dozens of naked Juon, myself included," he said while laughing so hard he was shaking. "We didn't know what to do. Half of us ran for the water and the other half of us bowed." "What did you do?" "Well, I did a combination of bowing and trying to bury my naughty bits in the sand as fast as I could." "What did the Empress do?" one of his crew asked as they were all laughing and gasping for breath. "Well, at first she was furious," the captain said, still laughing. "She thought we had been stripped. Then she saw piles of clothes on the beach, and she laughed her beak off. While laughing nearly uncontrollably, she announced that she would debark again in 10 minutes, and then, giggling like a hatchling, went back into the ship. It took a while for the Juon, the captain included, to stop laughing. Remember that the next time you are so embarrassed that you feel like throwing yourself out of an airlock. "The Empress saw me naked," Captain Zural said with a laugh. "Well, after 10 minutes passed and we had fled, she once again debarked and toured the camp. She was quite pleasantly surprised at how nice our accommodations were, and after getting a pina colada, she settled herself down into a tide pool and drank while she nibbled on starfish and sea urchins. Tag showed up pretty quickly, and once he did, she had the new Lord Chancellor and the first military commanders hauled out, and she said, 'These people do not represent the Empire nor our values.' She then hacked them into pieces in front of him." The captain chuckled. "You have to admit, that is one hell of a way to start negotiations." She and Tak hammered out a treaty over the afternoon. She started things off with, and I quote, "You fuckers are not worth the trouble. You want out. You are out." The rest of the time was stuff like possession of dead systems and the like. She made the same pronouncement across the entire Empire, saying that she promised change. But if any system wanted to leave the protection of the Empire had better things to do than stop them. The captain paused to refill his dish. "Why am I still drinking this?" he said. "In the end, only the Kalesh system chose to leave. The Mux voted to remain. Kalesh and Saul are conveniently close, so a new treaty was drawn up to include territory between them, and the new entity was recognized as the Terran Republic," the captain said with a thump of his tentacle. "And the rest is history." "I still don't understand why you are allies," Azush said. "Well," Sheila responded, "there are 2 big reasons. The first is what happened after the shooting stopped. The Porkies had wormed their way into the Federation, and no sooner than we had the Empire out of our hair, the Federation showed up with a fleet and invited us to join. They then presented us with a long list of bullshit requirements like disarming and a maximum size to our defense forces, and last but not least, the restoration of property unlawfully taken from its original owners. Needless to say, we told them in no uncertain terms to go and fuck themselves. While they were trying to negotiate terms that we would accept, the imperial companies we used to do business with started getting back in touch, wondering if we could do business again. On one hand, we had a lot of bullshit, and on the other, we had multi-billion credit contracts. Sheila shrugged. It went without saying that we turned our backs on the feds and started making those sweet, sweet credits. Business ties grew into social and cultural ties, and in a few years we all decided to let things slide. And in a few more we actually did. The other big reason is that we are culturally much more similar to the Empire than the Federation. We have a lot of the same cultural values. It's weird, but true. We do. The Juan and Terrans eat the same things, find the same things funny, we even curse the same. Once we got past the whole we tried to kill each other thing. We found out how alike we were, including our ability to get past the whole we tried to kill each other thing. Sheila paused to drink some coffee. We were on very good terms, but we weren't true allies until the Great War. Project Lifeline turned to direct military involvement pretty quickly. I'll tell you one thing, the captain said with a smile. I will never forget the Japura system. We were fighting a losing battle about to lose yet another world. And suddenly the Terrans tore into the system, guns blazing. The captain smiled. It was the first time I actually felt hope in a long while. I guess it does make sense, everything considered. One of the Zouche said. Well, as much as anything involving the Terrans does anyhow, the captain said. He then turned to his crew. Okay, guys, you have the rest of the day to get yourselves into something resembling fighting condition. Then we have an actual job to do. He turned to Sheila and in a much quieter voice asked, So what's next for you guys, or do I want to know? There are some jobs we have been thinking about but haven't done because we didn't want to draw too much heat, Sheila said with a smile. Now that we are Federation enemy number 1 and can't really get any more heat than we already have, we are going to step things up a bit. She smiled impishly. I don't want to give away the surprise, but you will see it on the news.